how can we talk about Berserk without mentioning Griffith, the manga's ultimate antagonist, responsible for one of the worst acts of betrayal possible, but also endowed with a singular aura and immense charisma, all while being a character with a complicated psychology full of contradictions. All this makes Griffith a very complex character to deal with, because he's also a very mysterious, very ambiguous character who's going to lose us a bit. I don't think anyone can say with any certainty that they've fully understood Griffith's character. Analyzing Griffith necessarily means giving your own interpretation of the character. What's more, as Griffith is a character who is built much less around his own point of view than around that of other characters, and as his impact on the world around him is colossal, we're going to have to talk about things that aren't linked to Griffith's development strictly speaking, but which are nonetheless constitutive of the character's writing. Note also that throughout Berserk, Kentaro Miura regularly uses the implicit to tell his story. Whether it's through suggestions, double entendre dialogues, parallels in the composition of the pages, the paneling, or even simple facial expressions. He knows perfectly well how to use the codes of his medium to make a show don't tell, or to keep things mysterious and let us interpret certain things in our own way. In short, all this to say that if there's one character for whom this style of narration is blatantly obvious, it's Griffith, and that obviously the analysis I'm about to give you is not to be taken as an absolute objective truth or that. It never is, but let's just say that it's even less so with a character as difficult to understand as Griffith. And of course, as with Guts, this complete analysis will only be complete by name, since Berserk isn't finished, and there are bound to be things I won't think of. By this, I mean that I'm going to talk about anything interesting I can think of to say about him, based on what we currently have. Anyway, today I'm going to talk about my second favorite character of all mediums because, yes, I warned you, I'm a big Berserk fanboy, so today we're going to talk about Griffith. We first meet Griffith in the Black Swordsman arc, and right away he's introduced as the manga's main antagonist. He's a god hand, a sort of superpowered evil god, and seems to crystallize all the hatred Guts feels to be the source of it. And if Griffith seems truly untouchable, we're made to understand that it's thanks to Guts, through a kind of sacrifice of which he was the victim, that he is where he is. In short, the Eclipse and the finality of the Golden Age arc are somewhat spoiled. And that brings us to the first point I wanted to make. Because of this, a lot of people seriously advise new readers not to read this arc, and to start directly with the end of Volume 3. And for me, that's a big mistake. I've already talked a bit about this in the video on Guts, but the fact that we're shown the consequences of the Golden Age before we even start it will not only pique our curiosity, as we wonder what this Griffith could have done so terrible to make Guts feel such hatred towards him, but it will also make the dramatic conclusion of the Golden Age inescapable. We know that whatever happens, it's going to end badly. We'll read the Golden Age arc with this sword of Damocles hanging over our heads, wondering when it will come down, and for what reason. All the more so as everything seems perfect at first glance. What's more, the inevitability of Griffith's betrayal reinforces this implacable causality, from which there is no escape, and which will be one of the main themes of the entire manga. Not to read the Black Swordsman arc before the Golden Age is to deprive yourself of part of the reading experience that Miura himself wanted us to feel, albeit improvised. Also, there's a page in the Black Swordsman arc that we often tend to forget about Griffith, and which I find interesting. It's a little flashback that Guts has after Griffith pushes him away. This page sums up everything about the Griffith of the Golden Age. He's a man with a good understanding of the environment in which he lives, a society dominated by a handful of nobles, in which the lives of the people who serve them are of little value. Dominance exploiting the dominated, but unable even themselves to possess what they really desire, leading a meaningless existence until death comes to take their turn. Everyone goes with the flow, he says, as if to point out that people are socially determined. Causality, all that, but he doesn't want to be one of them. He doesn't want to lead a meaningless existence like they do. He wants to be above them, to be the possessor of a divine essence, as he puts it. In short, in just one page, we're already shown the reasons why Griffith wants to become God Hand, as well as Guts' fascination with him. All things that we'll be able to develop throughout the Golden Age. Griffith is a character at odds with Guts in many ways, and one of them is that, unlike Guts, whom we've been able to follow literally from birth, Griffith is a character whose past we know nothing about. He has no parents, no family, no precise birthplace, no place to go home to. No, he has nothing except a dream, to have his own kingdom. But what for? To have his own kingdom to do what? For what purpose? To change society? For wealth? For glory? No, nothing like that. He just wants his kingdom, his castle, for no other reason, without even thinking about what he could do with it. Like a child who wants a particular toy and won't give up until he gets it. And that's what we're shown in one of the only 2 flashbacks to Griffith as a child, when he's imprisoned and tortured. Ah, the little wars declared on the cobblestones of my childhood, the little fame gained, the tawdry spoils of war stolen. When night fell I could see it when I looked up, in those alleys of brothels and bars, where the light never made its way. In the glow of twilight he was to my eyes the thing that shone with incomparable brilliance. I made up my mind. The spoils of war I would get would be this one. Griffith's dream is childishly simple. He's obsessed with the castle which, when he was a wretched child, was the only light that came to him, the one thing that always fascinated him. And that's a bit of a weird justification to hear, because in the end it's completely absurd. Rationally it doesn't make any sense. I mean, okay, you've got a castle, that's cool, but what are you going to do with it? What are you going to do with it once you've got it? What use will it be? Griffith doesn't know, he doesn't care, he doesn't even want to be happy, or to leave his mark on history by accomplishing great things. He wants the castle, and that's all. And I find the absolute aspect of his dream truly fascinating. In fact, it's as if Griffith intuitively understood the absurdity of our very existence and chose not to give a damn, just to behave like a child, giving himself a goal that has no other purpose than itself. Because when it comes down to it, when you're looking for the meaning of your existence, your purpose in life and so on, you can't help but wonder what your purpose is. If we start asking ourselves why for every goal we set ourselves, we'll end up realizing, by dint of going back again and again to the reasons for our actions for our goal, that there's no real answer. And so, what's the point of trying to find a complex and profound meaning to one's existence, one's goal, one's dream, if the conclusion of this search only leads us to an absence of answers? It's enough to want the castle for its own sake, and nothing else. Personally, I'm fascinated by this slightly absurd objective, which, at first glance, yields absolutely nothing tangible for the person who wants to achieve it, and who will nonetheless do everything in his power to reach it. There are lots of parallels to be drawn with other works, such as La Horde du Contrevent, a French novel with the quest to find the origin of the wind by going to the end of the world, or The Summit of the Gods, or The Climber, with the absurd quest to reach the top of a mountain just to reach it even if it means dying, etc. And I think I'll dedicate a whole video to that one day, because it's an important subject for me, but one that I really struggle to find the words to express properly. One thing's for sure though, Griffith's really going all out to achieve this goal. What happens next is very unclear, we only know bits and pieces. But to sum up, he's going to form a group of thieves in the first instance, made up almost exclusively of very young members, who are going to raise money so that they can become a mercenary troop, the Falcon Troop. After that, in order to earn even more money and influence, he'll wage battle after battle, recruiting commoners and children, and racking up victory after victory, all without the slightest outside support. Everything goes perfectly. But there's a seemingly insignificant element that will be very important later on, the death of one of the children in the troop, whose name will never be known. An ordinary 10-year-old boy, dreaming of becoming a knight, and admiring Griffith as a legendary hero, and who ends up being killed in one of the battles. This death would make Griffith realize that the childish dream he cherished could put an end to that of others, that the sacrifice of others' dreams might be necessary for the realization of his own. Too accustomed as he was to perfect victories, he had never realized that his rise was based on the corpses of enemies and allies he piled up as he went along. And this is going to upset him. He hates it, in fact. It repulses him because he can't give up his dream. It's unthinkable for him. It would be like dying. But on the other hand, the idea of making others suffer, of crushing their dreams in favor of his own, seems unbearable to him, because he knows just how precious it is, given the importance he attaches to his own dream. So how does he resolve this dilemma? Well, by trying not to feel the slightest guilt towards those he's sacrificing for his dream, considering that they themselves were masters of their own destiny, that accompanying him was their choice. Of course, he doesn't really believe it himself. It's not for nothing that he scratches himself to death when he says he feels no remorse whatsoever for his fallen comrades, and it's to compensate for this guilt that he'll sacrifice himself in turn for his dream. It's nice to be a good-looking, clean-cut guy who wins battle after battle without getting too wet. But it's not so nice to prostitute yourself to a filthy rich old man and make as much money in one night without the loss of a single soldier as would have been earned in a dozen battles. Griffith told Casca, "My dream is stained with blood. I can only fulfill it on their remains. Remorse and guilt have no place here. However, I cannot hope to receive the gift of hundreds, thousands of lives without having to give of myself." Casca, who probably understood Griffith best, would say of Griffith that he is not this intrinsically exceptional, almost superhuman character that everyone seems to believe. He's just a man with a dream so out of proportion that he had to become strong out of necessity. He's not fundamentally a strong, perfect, unflappable person. And that's something you absolutely must understand for the rest of the story. Because the arrival of another character will completely upset the apparent inflexibility Griffith has built up and cause him to lose sight of his dream. And now we're going to get to the part of the video that might cause a bit of a stir. I hesitated to make it a video in its own right with a clickbait title because I thought it would be funny, but this subject fits in so well with a general analysis of Griffith that it would have been a shame to separate it from the video. I'm talking of course about Griffith's obvious love for Guts and anything that suggests Griffith is gay. And before the more reactionary among you jump down my throat and say, "Who cares, you don't understand the manga, it's woke propaganda, no LGBT in my Berserk blah blah blah," let me argue a little and explain how Griffith's homosexuality is crucial to the story and why it makes the whole Golden Age arc an exceptionally well written arc in my eyes. Because we don't really care about Griffith's sexuality in itself, the important thing is what it allows the story to tell. Griffith is a character who is ambiguous from the moment he meets Guts, when he says he wants him. In fact, Guts taunts him for this right after, but that doesn't stop Griffith from keeping this ambiguity just afterwards when he says, when he wins his fight, that Guts belongs to him now. Of course, this doesn't prove anything, but it just goes to show that Miura was quick to establish a certain ambiguity in Griffith's relationship with Guts, even if at this point in the story, everything leads us to believe that it's just a form of fascination they have for each other. Guts for Griffith's singular aspect, as I explained in the video dedicated to him, and Griffith for the fact that nothing seems to have any hold on Guts, not even death, while paradoxically searching for the reason that drives him to go on living. And we're going to continue this kind of honest, somewhat ambiguous friendship for the next 3 years with scenes like the one of the bath, where Griffith has fun with Guts throwing water over his head, and where he tells him about his dream, among other things. In short, it's a bit of a bromance with a very strong friendship developing, and there's nothing to indicate that Griffith is actually attracted to Guts at the moment, it's just a bit ambiguous. It's a trope that's often found in shoujo, for example, bearing in mind that Miura was heavily influenced by the shoujos of his time, The Rose of Versailles to name but one, with Oscar for example, a character who greatly inspired Griffith, at least in terms of chara design. But generally speaking, we don't see Griffith having any sexual attraction at any time during this period, and the only sexual act we know of on his part at the moment is the time he spent a night with the disgusting older count, as I said earlier. In short, there's absolutely nothing sentimental about it, and it's exactly the same when he goes courting Charlotte for that matter. At no time was he attracted to her, he never loved her, the only thing he saw in her was her accession to the throne of Midland. He only saw his dream, as always. Except that's where the important point comes in, Guts. As I've already said, for Griffith, only his dream matters. He has real sympathy for the members of the Falcon troop, he likes them, but they remain a tool in the realization of his dream. This is what he tells us with all his talk about dreams and friendship in the fountain scene, which I've already talked about quite a bit in the video on Guts. Griffith explains that a friend is someone who has their own dream, who doesn't submit to their own, someone who is their equal. This is what Guts wants to do by leaving the troop, except that Guts hasn't understood Griffith. As usual, it was Casca who understood everything, and that's why Casca has a terrible grudge against Guts, though I'll have a chance to go into all that in detail in the video dedicated to her. After telling Guts about her past and her meeting with Griffith just before the 1 vs 100, Casca goes back over the meeting between Griffith and Guts and Griffith's famous "I want you." She'll say that she too thought Griffith was just making a calculation for Guts' skills. But the thing is, on several occasions, Casca felt that Griffith changed in the presence of Guts, that the usually calm and thoughtful Griffith became impulsive, as if he actually loved Guts. She doesn't dare finish her sentence, but that's clearly what she means, it seems obvious to me. Griffith never wanted to think of Guts as a friend with a dream of his own, or even as another of his troopmates pandering to his dream. Griffith loves Guts, and because of this, he goes so far as to forget his own dream when Guts is present. This is far beyond the simple friendship he himself described in the fountain scene. We can see this at moments that are a little subtle, such as when he plots with Guts to kill Julius and then the Queen. Not only does this show just how important Guts is to Griffith, but it's only to him that he shows this darker side of himself. Casca may have had a glimpse of it too, as I explained earlier, but that's not so much the case today. But also because he's questioning the things he's making him do, the things that are essential to achieving his dream, not because he considers them immoral, but because he feels bad at the idea of making Guts do these immoral things. And he's also afraid of the image he's sending back to Guts, asking him if he thinks he's being unfair. And it's Guts who reminds him that he's doing it for his dream, and that he doesn't have to worry about himself. He's even surprised by Griffith's attitude, finding it incoherent because he doesn't understand how Griffith feels about him. But the most telling example of this is during the confrontation with Zod, when Griffith literally risks his life to save Guts, and would have died if Zod hadn't seen the bearit hanging around his neck. And when Guts questions him about it, asking why he risked his life just for a precious asset to fulfill his dream, Griffith simply replies that he has no explanation for it. And I'm sorry, but when he asks Guts if he really needs him to give him a reason why he would risk his life for him, with all the context I've given you in mind, it's pretty hard for me to imagine anything other than love. But then again, Guts will never understand that. And it's this lack of understanding that leads to the famous duel that Guts wins, after which he leaves the Falcon's troop. It is this misunderstanding that will lead through a chain of cause and effect to the Eclipse. For while Guts left Griffith in the belief that he would bounce back, Griffith will be completely destroyed by Guts' departure. Just look at the expression on his face just before this fight. Judo will say that he doesn't have his usual relaxed face, the one he had during some of the most important and perilous battles they've ever seen. And we even get access to Griffith's thoughts, which is very rare in the entirety of Berserk. Thoughts from which we learn that he doesn't want to let him go under any circumstances, even if it means killing him. That if he's no longer with him, it doesn't matter if he's dead or alive. But he will lose. For the first time in his life, he will lose. He's going to lose the most important battle he's ever fought. And this defeat will make him go into a tailspin. Then we have that scene you all know, where he goes to bed with Charlotte right afterwards, which some see as a counter-argument, as proof of Griffith's heterosexuality, as if he's going to the woman he loves to console himself for the loss of his friend, when in fact it's the exact opposite. For me, this scene is the ultimate proof of Griffith's love for Guts. I mean, he knows full well that by this act, he's abandoning his dream, or at least that there's a good chance he's going to destroy it. It's really an uncontrollable impulse trying to compensate in vain for the loss of Guts. And it's all the more obvious as we're shown very explicitly that when he sleeps with Charlotte from start to finish, all he does is think about Guts. And we see this even more at the end of the scene, which has become a fairly popular meme, where he's really disgusted by what he's just done with Charlotte. And there's this really incredible page just after where we see Griffith crying for one of the few times in the whole history of Berserk, holding some kind of imaginary scar on his shoulder, referring to the sword strike that Guts stopped during their fight, like a metaphorical wound making him suffer terribly. But also the last thing he had left of Guts, the last thing that mattered, even more important than his dream. And maybe I'm going too far, but I can't help but draw a parallel between the frame where he's curled up holding this imaginary wound, and another very similar frame of Guts as a child, holding his sword, which was the only thing he had left, the only thing that still mattered. The parallel being both visually and in terms of meaning. In short, at that point, Griffith had truly lost everything. He is then imprisoned and tortured, and he has a dialogue with the king that I find super interesting. Griffith realizes that the king really wanted to have sex with his own daughter, seeing his first wife through her, while trying to hide it. He tells him, "You've lived a long time indulging your monstrosity, but you've never tried to control it. You invented the threat of the great responsibilities of the throne, brandishing it endlessly, but you never saw it as anything other than a burden. You were content not to fail. For what?" And the reason I quote this is because it has a double meaning for me. I think Griffith is at the same time describing his own situation. The monstrosity he has never tried to control is his love for Guts, and the burden of the throne is the burden of his dream. And this double meaning is for me supported by the page we'll see later, where Griffith is alone in his cell and repeats, "For what? All this is of no point, none at all." That's what I've found absolutely brilliant since I've had that key to understanding in my head. Griffith is really a character living a kind of tragedy, opposing passion and duty. It's very Cornelian. The whole Golden Age arc has all the makings of a Cornelian tragedy, in fact, especially with Griffith's internal struggle and Guts' misunderstanding of him, which will lead to the horror we're all familiar with. It's all got a really powerful narrative. Finally, I'd like to end this section with a long quote that sums up everything I've said since the beginning of the video about Griffith, and which I think is one of the best passages in the whole manga. "Am I still sane? Or did I lose my mind a long time ago? Everything is lost in the void. Only one thing seems certain. He alone stands out in me, like lightning on a dark night. And so many sensations come back to me, like the waves of a tidal surge. Hatred, friendship, jealousy, vanity, spite, love, sadness, kindness, hunger. All-consuming sensations that come and go. None in particular, but a whirlwind of passions encompassing them all. This is all that keeps my consciousness on the precipice of oblivion and nothingness. I am well aware that I am different from other people. Anyone who meets me cannot remain indifferent and must feel either benevolence or enmity towards me. Kindness comes from trust, from camaraderie, whereas enmity is rooted in fear, even terror. I know all this. That's why I've taken control of so many hearts with my own hand. But why? Why, when I think of him, is it impossible for me to maintain my usual calm? He, through whose fault I found myself plunged into these abysses. He who became the main source of energy keeping me alive. Amongst my hundreds of companions, my thousands of enemies, he, only he. Why is this so? How long has it been like this? Since when has he taken control of me when it should have been me who took control of him? Did the game I used to play on the cobblestones of the back streets never end? This pilgrimage to obtain this booty, sacred among all? But now it's mingling with this relic. Their brilliance hurts my eyes.
Guts.
Then comes Griffith's rescue. Just before that, Casca is still trying to make Guts understand how important he was to Griffith, and Guts is starting to wonder, remembering 2 sentences I emphasized earlier. But anyway, they find Griffith in the state, you know. And then Griffith's thoughts will be very hazy and open to interpretation, since he'll be as speechless as he is thoughtless. Does he try to strangle Guts when he sees him again? And why? What is the meaning of the look he gives Casca and Guts on several occasions as he begins to understand their closeness? What does it mean when he climbs on top of Casca in the cart? Who is he actually jealous of? Because yes, I've gone to great lengths to explain to you that Griffith loves Guts, but there are also some slightly ambiguous moments with Casca in everything that happens before the eclipse, and that shouldn't be ignored either. But I tend to see it more like he sees her as a plan B of sorts, that he knows she worships him, and that's probably all he's got left. And it's going to hurt him even more to see her pity him by holding him close. He's really going to realize that he's nothing. Even the woman who used to look at him like a god now feels nothing but pity for him. And when Griffith hears Casca tell Guts to leave, when he realizes that it was to be his friend, that Guts left the troop, and that that's why he's leaving again, he knows it's all over. After hearing this, he will have a hallucination of himself, telling him to go and find his castle. Knowing that Guts would go off and leave him behind again, he decides to go back and chase his dream, to chase the only source of light he could see in the dark alleys of his childhood. Then, when he crashes, he faints for a moment and, for a few pages, has a sort of dream of the future that he imagines in the light of his current situation. A dream in which he sees Casca looking after him, with a child they've named Guts, a dog they've named Pippin, and old memories of the past. A sort of calm, peaceful future, where he has forgotten his dream and Guts. But he barely has time to think about it that the Beharat wakes him from his dream. Griffith, once again aware of the state of his body, and bored by the prospects before him, attempts suicide, but even that doesn't work. And it was at the height of his despair that he found the bear hit in the water. Griffith seems to know instinctively what is going to happen, and tries in vain to shout to Guts not to come any closer, as if he is aware of the sacrifice he is going to have to make. But he's unable to speak, Guts joins him, and the eclipse begins. As we can see from this whole explanation, even now, Griffith is still the Griffith who cares about his companions, and especially about Guts. It's not all that time spent being tortured that's changed him, he's still fundamentally the same, he's just more aware of his own feelings. So how are the God Hands going to convince him to sacrifice the troop? Well, by playing with who he really is. First of all, they'll remind him of that dream, that castle he's obsessed with, and remind him that the path he's built to get there is littered with corpses. They remind him of the child who died under his command, the child who had left such a deep impression on him. All these deaths he caused, including among his own companions, were sacrifices necessary to the realization of his dream, as has already been said. And as we've also said, these sacrifices he's forced to make are an unbearable burden for Griffith, and that's what the God Hands are going to play on. Not only, given the state of his body, if Griffith gives up now, he'll die too, but on top of that, all the deaths he's caused will have been for nothing, and it's almost out of duty that he should continue to sacrifice even more lives to achieve his goal, so that these deaths finally have a meaning. This is a fairly well-known cognitive bias known as sunk costs, which is quite remarkable in the world of finance, for example, but which has also been very well noted in concrete cases, quite similar in a way to the Eclipse dilemma. This is often the case for military operations, or even wars fought abroad, the most famous case being the Vietnam War, where everyone knew that continuing would lead to nothing, but where some politicians tried to convince people to continue so that the soldiers who had already died in the war didn't die for nothing, even though the end result would only be more deaths. All this to say that at this point, because of his own sensitivity to the lives of his companions, and because of this cognitive bias of sunk costs, he can't stop. He's thrown something far too big to turn back. If he apologizes, if he regrets, it will all be over, and he'll never be able to get to that castle he's so obsessed with. So he will choose to sacrifice the troop, then he'll find himself face to face with Guts, repeating the sentence he's been mulling over throughout his torture, and which has kept him alive, finally completing it. Among these thousands of companions, these tens of thousands of enemies, only one, you, made me lose sight of my dream. And so, mourning his relationship with Guts, Griffith decides to sacrifice the troop, and then Griffith will fade away to be replaced by Femto. Everything about him is going to change radically. His very nature will change when he becomes God Hand. And here we get into a very vague and somewhat theoretical part, particularly through what I was able to explain in the video about causality and the fact that the God Hand control it. When he talks to Idea in the deleted chapter, which should be taken with a pinch of salt, Griffith learns that his whole life has been mapped out from the start to lead him to this point, that he has been manipulated in some way so that he can become, paradoxically, a being freed from causality and so be truly free. All this will answer the questions he was asking himself in the little flashback in Volume 3 we mentioned at the beginning, and it also allows him to feel less guilty about the troops' sacrifice, but it's not enough to justify his radical change, and especially the act he's going to commit against Casca, which for me is the biggest point of incomprehension in the Eclipse. First of all, we could assume that it was a completely calculated act, that he did it to allow the birth of the cursed fetus child who would later become the famous Moonchild, and that it all served a wider plan that he had been developing since he took control of causality. In fact, after his resurrection at the Sword Hill, he will say that he used the child. But I half believe it, because he's more a source of weakness for Griffith, who wanted so badly to break away from the hold Guts had over him, who wanted to be totally free to fulfill his dream. But the main thing that makes me think this is that what he does to Casca clearly seems to be pure revenge against Guts. This scene has been heavily criticized by a lot of people, and is one of the most striking points of the manga, so I'm going to have to spend a bit of time on it, and do what I can to avoid being demonetized. But yes, Griffith's act is clearly staged like a porn film. It's a purely ostentatious scene, and if I understand the critics of this scene, and how it can put some people off, it has a very precise meaning. The target of this aggression is none other than Guts. Casca is just a tool in Griffith's hands to attack Guts, which is even more terrible for her. You only have to look at the way Griffith stares at Guts several times to realize that this scene is all about him. That's why it's so ostentatious, why it's so long, why it's so unbearable to watch. That's the effect Griffith wanted to have on Guts. All this to say that Femto seems to be fundamentally different from Griffith, who, just before sacrificing the troop, didn't seem to have any real hatred for Guts. The look on his face as he sacrifices him is hard to describe, but it seems to be a mixture of melancholy and acceptance. It was as if it hurt him to make this choice, but in a way relieved him a little, that he was putting the whole thing behind him, mourning it. Whereas a few minutes later, in the form of Femto, what we see here is clearly an expression of visceral hatred towards the man who made him lose sight of his dream, while denying his feelings by pairing up with Casca. It's an extremely brutal change, and when I look for reasons for this change, the only plausible justification that comes to mind is that the God Hand are simply fundamentally evil. It's as if becoming one exacerbates all the worst sides of a person, something we've also already seen with the Apostles. We could also see this as a way for him to purge what he once was, to draw a definitive line under all his feelings by blowing them all up at once. Because later, at the end of the Conviction arc, Griffith will be resurrected and return to human form. He will be able to leave the Nexus, the world of ideas, to return to the real world and fulfill his dream. And it's after this resurrection that we see one of the other facets of this new Griffith, his lack of emotion. He is now totally focused on his dream. He goes back to see Guts during the famous scene on the Sword Hill to be absolutely sure, to see if he's going to hesitate between his dream and Guts like he used to, but no, that's no longer the case. He's free. Well, not quite. Because just before being resurrected, the Egg Apostle, who will serve as a kind of egg that will allow Griffith to be reborn, is going to eat the cursed fetus child so that it can be reborn with him. This child, who is the child of Guts and Casca but whom Griffith has somehow corrupted during the Eclipse, will share his body with Griffith and will transmit to him the feelings he has towards his parents, creating a flaw in the perfect being he had become. In short, we get a Griffith who has, in a way, the body he once had, while having this God Hand nature that makes him completely impassive, devoid of feelings. He's nothing more than a machine making cold calculations, with the aim of realizing the dream he's always been obsessed with, and that's how he's going to leave Guts and his past behind to accomplish it. At that moment, everyone present held their breath and could not take their eyes off him, and all had the intuition that the one they had been waiting for had arrived. As we've said, after his resurrection, Griffith's nature will no longer be at all the same as the Griffith of the past, but it's also the very nature of his character, in the narrative sense, that will no longer have anything to do with it. From now on, we won't be exploring the slightest part of his psyche, and his thoughts will be completely sealed off from the reader. The only things we'll see of Griffith will be through the eyes of those who see him, like a living legend, like a completely supernatural being. Miura sums it up well in the guidebook interview. I portray Griffith as someone who rarely shares his moods, but I decided to highlight him by surrounding him with characters who, for their part, spill the beans about how they feel. And while the story of Berserk has always been completely centered on Guts, from this point on, it will be divided into two points of view. The first is still that of Guts, of course, but the second will be that, not of Griffith, but of those who will experience the fulfillment of Griffith's dream. I'll take the time to explain how Griffith will fulfill his dream, but don't worry, we'll talk about the reflections that follow afterwards. This legendary aspect of the fulfillment of Griffith's dream, then, is constantly supported, and has even been prepared for throughout the Conviction arc with that famous dream that everyone has, that of the Falcon of Light that would come to chase away the darkness of this world to save us all, building on the symbol of victory that it was during the Golden Age, the last period when the Kingdom of Midland was still prosperous. But there's also this feeling that everyone senses, this feeling that the world itself is changing since his return. In short, Griffith has all the makings of a messiah, and he's going to fuel that vision by going out to save the Midland from the Kushan invasion, through his victories in small battles that get bigger and bigger as his troops, this new band of the Falcon, get bigger and bigger. In fact, he's literally remaking the arc of the Golden Age. It's exactly the same principle, except that here, everything is much bigger, much more beautiful, much more perfect. His very first battle is a fine example of this, when he kills the Kushan general as if he were going shopping, when a salvo of arrows is sent his way but none of them hits him, the Kushan soldiers who are slaughtered in 2 seconds without any casualties on his side, and the conclusion where Sonya says, "Such a landscape should be bathed in horror, and yet it looked like a painting of unparalleled beauty. We were for real, in the middle of a legendary tale." And even outside battle, Griffith reinforced his divine side by invoking the souls of those who had died in battle, to let them speak to their families one last time. Not to mention his supernatural beauty, his charisma, his words, and even his voice. He really is a living myth. Everything about him oozes perfection. He saves Charlotte with such simplicity and elegance that it's almost like a little girl dreaming of her Prince Charming. He goes to see the Pope, the supreme authority of Midland, and even the other surrounding countries, and the Pope, who wasn't even really a believer in the first place, kneels before him. All the people we see around him will only insist over and over again that he seems out of reach, and that's without mentioning the dream of the Falcon of Light that comes up again and again. In fact, Griffith is certainly realizing his dream, but it's all too easy, too beautiful, too guided. You can feel the big script strings behind it all, and that's normal. It's all just a script written by God hand and idea. Griffith's perfection is so overdone that it's almost absurd. And that's without counting on Miura's immense formal talent, which is going to carry all this through. The drawings are going to improve enormously, gaining in finesse and detail, and in the passages concerning Griffith's point of view in any case, they're going to be ultra bright all the time. The whole thing is supported by an extremely spectacular and grandiloquent paneling with lots of impressively composed full pages, where Griffith is almost always at the center of attention, in close-up, or with large panels featuring his face. And whether from a purely narrative or purely formal point of view, the climax of all this will come when he clashes with Ganishka, the apostle and supreme emperor of the Kushan Empire, the greatest empire on earth according to what he says, and we're going to take a look at that too because it's important for understanding how he's brought things about. The Kushan are a threat that Miura has been hinting at since the beginning of the Conviction arc, and which we've been able to gauge since they've conquered almost the whole of Midland, including its capital, and they're using occult magic to create monsters, something that's never been seen before in conventional warfare. This has nothing to do with the Tudor threat, and in fact all the papacy's countries are going to try to unite to defeat this common enemy. There really is a very evil and occult side to the Kushans, and to their emperor in particular. Just look at how they've turned Wyndham, the capital of Midland, into a truly horrific place, with corpses hanging everywhere. And then there's the way they fight, through magic as I said, but also through their assassins, who are quite dehumanized by the way, since they hardly ever speak. Not to mention the famous disgusting experiments that Ganishka has done to create monsters, and even worse, Ganishka who reigns supreme over all this through fear. Shihat will sum it all up by describing Ganishka as the Emperor of Terror, and everything will be done to ensure that this is the case. Because Ganishka is also an apostle, an extremely powerful apostle, probably the most powerful, who even seems invincible since he can take on an almost immaterial form, like a cloud, capable of creating lightning, with destructive power on a scale never seen before. In fact, it will take the alliance of Zod and Guts to beat even a materialization of his body in this form, as his real body is actually 100 kilometers away. What's more, he's presented as the only apostle to oppose the God Hands themselves head-on, to want to rule over absolutely everything, and even become God no less. In short, he's the ultimate villain, very Manichaean, very powerful, very terrifying. And yet, when he comes face to face with Griffith, he's going to tremble. He's going to be shaken by his mere presence, even just by the intonation of his voice, as if he's going mad. When Griffith offers him his hand, he will say, "No, if he touches me, I'll give him everything." But Griffith, after humiliating him, offers to postpone the final battle and carry it out in Wyndham, the capital of Midland. And that's when things take on a whole new dimension. I'm referring of course to volume 34. But even before that, Ganishka will take his role as ultimate antagonist even further by transcending himself for a twin time through an artificial Beherit, becoming a kind of gigantic monster, thus triggering hostilities and the final phase in the fulfillment of Griffith's dream. Sonya says, "It's over. The logic of this world, it ends here." In the guidebook interview in 2016, Miura said, "To establish a character on Griffith's level, you have to pit him against a character almost as extraordinary. That's why he overplayed Ganishka's power and madness so much, why he put so much effort into the construction of the plot. It's all to make him a barrel of laughs on an enormous scale, as he puts it, so that he's just Griffith's stooge. But anyway, from this point on, it won't be a fight between the Kushan Empire and Midland and a few allied countries. No, it will be a fight between humanity as a whole and an evil monster bent on its destruction. The most Manichaean battle there is. A kind of almost utopian vision, in fact, where the whole of humanity, faced with a purely evil common enemy bent on destruction, would eventually put all its differences aside and join forces to fight this evil. And so we come to volume 34. This volume is well known for its overabundance of crazy full-page spreads, ultra-detailed and all, but making full-page spreads that are teeming with detail isn't a quality in itself. I mean, these 60 full-page spreads are there for a specific narrative purpose, and aren't just impressive for the sake of being impressive. Well, yes they are, but that's precisely the point. The reason they are so preponderant and so impressive is that they are there to make us experience this final battle like something legendary, like a kind of illustrated myth that we would see in real time. Because it is indeed a myth that the people who follow Griffith are living. This is also very well supported by the evolution of Miura's drawing style, which was getting closer and closer to the engravings of Gustave Doré, an eminent 19th century French illustrator who produced numerous engravings illustrating myths such as Dante's Inferno, the Bible, etc., and whom Miura had already referred to in the manga before. And indeed, the very first full page of volume 34 seems to refer to one of these engravings, the one depicting the return of the Ark of the Covenant from the Old Testament, which is a chest that is said to have contained the tablets on which the Ten Commandments were engraved. And using such mythological references from the start of the volume, while using a similar drawing style, is a very effective way of showing us that we're literally living a myth guided by the hand of God. Once again, everything seems too easy, as if it's been choreographed to perfection, with each actor having rehearsed their role hundreds of times to make sure it's all nice and tidy. The appearance of the mini Ganishka demons, for example, serves no tactical purpose whatsoever, and isn't even a conscious act on Ganishka's part, since he himself has become a madman, obsessed with the light he sees in the distance. No, these monsters are just there to give the people accompanying Griffith something to fight about, to give them the impression that they're part of this epic final battle against a non-human and purely evil enemy, that they're part of the story and have a part to play. It's all just a setup to get people to experience an epic story that will go down in history. A glorious chaos, as the Pope would say. But in the end, the one who will have to deliver the final blow, the one at the head of this battle, the one at the center of this legend, is Griffith. And it is Griffith who will put an end to this parody of war. There's a truly magnificent scene with Ganishka, whose terrible flashback we see, after which he says, "Life, the world, is nothing but darkness," but where he finds, in Griffith, the true light he's always been looking for. And you know the rest. The Skull Knight intervenes, attacks Griffith. Griffith distorts space with his god hand power, and returns the blow to Ganishka, creating the world tree that will superimpose the astral world and the real world, previously separate. The ancient city of Falconia will appear and the Fantasia arc will begin. Griffith has obtained his kingdom, he has fulfilled his dream. For me, it's from this point on that we really see the opposition between Guts and Griffith, and Miura prepared us for this in an interview in 2000, after the Conviction arc, when he said that the relationship between Guts and Griffith would really begin. In order to ensure that the confrontation between Guts and Griffith wasn't just a simple question of revenge, Miura made sure to show us that they opposed each other on points of view that are absolutely fundamental to their very way of thinking. I'll refer you to the last few parts of the video on Guts for more detail, but to sum up quickly, Guts is a guy who doesn't try to put himself forward at all, he doesn't try to make himself famous, to look good in public and so on. However, he does have companions with whom he has forged strong bonds, and with whom mutual aid is very much encouraged, where he is not always the center of attention, and where he knows how to entrust essential tasks to others. The best example of this is the fact that he leaves all responsibility for waking Casca to Farnese and Shirka. They will also exert an influence on him, allowing him to evolve and become better. He leaves room for the others, in fact, and even though he naturally appears as the leader of the group, he's not really a leader. There's no vertical hierarchy, if you like. It's all about mutual support. But Griffith is the exact opposite of that. Of course, he's always tried to look good in society, always clean-cut, perfectly versed in the hypocritical game of court, etc., and that was already one of the points that set him against Guts in the Golden Age, but this goes much further. It goes much further for Guts, of course, who was just a slightly rough mercenary, and is now a devil magnet who's been completely ostracized by society, but it also goes much further for Griffith, who is now the savior of humanity, the supreme leader of what is now the only safe zone for humans, since monsters are appearing everywhere else. And when I say supreme leader, it's because he has all the power. Whereas Guts' group is a very egalitarian one, with horizontal relationships. With Griffith, we're really in a very vertical hierarchy, with him at the top. Absolutely everything revolves around him, and he almost crushes the other characters with his greatness. He's loved by everyone, even revered, but he has no friends, no one who's his equal. Everyone around him is merely subservient to his dream, whereas Guts' companions each follow him to achieve their own personal goals. Farnese to change his vision of the world, Serpico to follow Farnese, Isidro to become stronger, etc. And none of those who follow Griffith have the slightest influence on him. He doesn't change a bit, even though he has influence on everyone. Anyway, the whole Millennium Falcon arc shows us just how much Griffith is in total opposition to Guts, even when it comes to the Kara design, with Guts all in black and Griffith always in dazzling white, almost surreal. And for me, through Griffith, Miura continues his criticism of religious dogma and people's propensity to wait for a providential savior rather than organize themselves to save themselves. Griffith was clearly seen as a messiah, the great savior, for all the reasons we've already discussed, and this status legitimized him in the eyes of the people to such an extent that they questioned absolutely nothing about him and trusted him blindly. In fact, it's simple. They all think it's a miracle without asking any more questions. They don't ask themselves where he's been since he escaped from Wyndham, why he was imprisoned at the time, why he didn't intervene before if his power was so overwhelming, and so on. And what's more, even before he saved them, they were completely passive and waiting for him to come. Apart from a few marginal individuals, they were all waiting for the savior. They needed a figure to guide them. Of course, they were conditioned to wait for this savior through their dreams of the Falcon of Light, but the effectiveness that this dream had on people was itself due to another conditioning, that of the dogma imposed by the church. As we saw in the arc with the priest Mosgus, the church has long propagated a strict, purely dogmatic religion, where the slightest questioning is considered blasphemous, whether based on reality or not, and is horribly repressed. What's more, Midland is facing a serious time of crisis, with the Kushan invasion, the madness of its king, famines, the spread of the plague, the crime that stems from it all, and so on. Now, it's a well-known sociological fact that has been proven time and time again throughout history. Times of crisis make us much more accepting of authoritarianism, make us intolerant of nuance and therefore open the door to dogmatic thinking, the need to be guided by a strong leader and so on, and this is bound to be fertile ground for religious fanaticism. In short, the whole social context into which Griffith is going to insert himself to solve all the problems at once thanks to his one person was perfectly calibrated for the creation of a hegemonic kingdom with the added bonus of a supreme leader with his cult of personality. But Griffith went even further and tried to ensure the success, in particular by killing witches like Flora. In my opinion, this actually had two aims. The first, explained in volume 39, was to burn the spirit trees where the witches lived, because these trees sucked energy from the world tree, preventing the astral world and the real world from crossing too much. Griffith obviously wanted these two worlds to become one in order to realize his dream, so he asked his apostles to burn. The second aim, which is my personal interpretation, is to suppress any source of magic other than his own. Not just to deprive potential enemies of their power, since in any case it would be derisory in the face of his apostles and almost the whole of humanity, but more out of a refusal to see a supernatural being other than himself, so that in the eyes of mankind, he remains an exception, a unique divine being, in order to justify his total hold over them. That's why he takes the trouble to gather the spirits of the dead around him by putting on a bit of a show. Owen sums it up well when he says, whether it's hundreds of stories or a single doctrine, they all lose their power in the face of a scene like this. He argued that Griffith alone eclipsed all other religious beliefs, exactly as the church in Midland sought to do, having, for example, set up a church at the expense of an ancient shrine dedicated to Undine, thus wishing to impose its own belief. In fact, Griffith's witch hunt via his apostles bears a strong resemblance to the witch hunt of Mosgus and his inquisitors, itself inspired by the real witch hunts of the 17th century. Ultimately, we can see here an opposition between two types of faith. I told you in one of the previous videos that Berserk was not at all an anti-religious belief manga, but was an anti-dogma manga. And this for me is the perfect illustration of that. While the religion used by Griffith is a purely dogmatic one, where questioning is forbidden, the magical powers of witches are based on more ancient beliefs that are far removed from dogma, because witches have a much more scientific approach, much closer to reality. This is not at all incompatible in the world of Berserk, and it's also a way of thinking about religion that can be found in our world. As I think you've noticed, Berserk is a manga that is not at all Manichaean. Throughout the story we see characters who are flawed, complex and morally very grey, except at one point when we switch to Griffith's point of view, as we said, with Ganishka representing absolute evil and Griffith and his troop representing good. This is consistent with religious dogma, which is very Manichaean, where the distinction between good and evil is quite clear. And that's also why Griffith's entire achievement rings false. It creates quite a violent contrast with what Berserk has been up to now. It's even an outright change of subgenre, moving from dark fantasy to high fantasy. Miura will be talking about all this in an interview in 2019, when volume 40 comes out, where he will hypothesize that the lack of Manichaeanism in Berserk is quite natural in a context where Christian culture, which is rather Manichaean, is not at all rooted in Japanese culture, which therefore tends to produce non-Manichaean stories. as was the case with Devilman, from which he drew a lot of inspiration. But in short, this kind of dogmatic belief that Griffith imposes, we're protected from it, because we know its true face, we know where it all comes from, what manipulation it's based on. And if, on top of all that, we add this line from Shirka, where she says, "The messenger will become the hawk of darkness, the master of the black lambs for their crimes, and king of the blind white lambs, the one who will bring an era of darkness upon the world," then we understand very well that in the end, Griffith has all the makings of the Antichrist in fact. Not to mention what Miura says in the guidebook interview about Griffith and Falconia. It remains to be seen how the scene of this story, Fantasia, will turn out. You get the sense that it's all going to end badly, including for the people of Falconia, so I can't help but see it as a warning against dogmatism, while at the same time showing us a model to follow through Guts Group and the Witch's way of doing things, which isn't about being an unbeliever, but about always keeping, whether you're a believer or not, a critical mind, and a possible questioning of what you've always held to be true. And that's what this whole Millennium Falcon arc is about, narratively speaking, adding an ideological opposition on top of these different personalities to give even more stakes and depth to the confrontation between Guts and Griffith. And that, in my opinion, is what the whole ideological opposition between Guts and Griffith is based on. On the one hand, a far from perfect individual who doesn't see any help from a superior force, who advocates cooperation, open-mindedness and questioning, evolution in a way. And on the other, a perfect individual, helped by a superior force, completely individualistic, wanting hegemony in every way, remaining exactly the same from start to finish, and seeing himself as ruling the whole world without sharing. But now, Griffith has fulfilled his dream, and so we might wonder what he's going to do now. As we said earlier, Griffith never thought for a single second about the aftermath. Getting his castle was the finality of his dream, there was no underlying goal. And so now, that's it, it's over. It's easy to imagine Griffith simply enjoying his dream, taking advantage of his kingdom, and administering it peacefully until his death. Unless, of course, Griffith's obsession with his castle is really just the expression of a deeper desire, perhaps unleashed by his transformation into God Hand, to rise higher and higher and higher. In Elfheim, Guts describes it as follows. Taking over his kingdom is only one step. He aims for heights, surpasses them, and continues to fly towards infinity. That is the nature of the hawk, the nature of Griffith. So of course we can see that he's looking to make the most of his kingdom and administer it. He's planning his wedding to Charlotte, making political decisions and so on. But he's also looking to expand it, to make it the one and only empire of mankind, still in this logic of hegemony, and is going to go to war outside against devils for this very reason, devils that he himself has made appear by linking the real world to the astral world. It should also be noted that the Griffith of today is no longer the Griffith of before the eclipse. He is a being devoid of emotion, who plays with causality and has superior knowledge. He's a God Hand, so it's hard to really pinpoint his goal, but in any case, he seems to want to keep going higher and higher, endlessly. It's a futile quest because there's no end to it. It's a bit like Plato's image of the pierced barrel in Gorgias, which I mentioned in the video about Denji from Chainsaw Man, except that it settles the question of the aftermath, since there won't be one. Maybe that's why he wants to go beyond his dream, again and again, because he just doesn't know what else to do. Or maybe it's his God Hand nature that has made him lose sight of his real dream, to have the castle and nothing more. Griffith's lack of emotion, and the fact that everything has been ultra-guided throughout, the fact that he's done it all almost robotically in fact, without the slightest sense of accomplishment, reminds me a bit of a guy who wants to finish his video game 100% without bothering and plays, with the game's tips at hand, or even cheat codes, and completes the list of tasks and side quests he still has to do mechanically, without the slightest pleasure. And Griffith would try to compensate for this by looking for something bigger and more exceptional. Or maybe he has an even bigger plan as God Hand, that he's caught up in something much larger, that he feels invested with a bit of a mission, and that would tie in with his questions in Volume 3, with his desire to know what his role is, why he exists. Perhaps this questioning is even more important than his dream. After all, it's the very first description we have of the character, and he tells Guts that he'd never shared these thoughts with anyone else. And given that Idea responds to this in the deleted chapter, and that he seems to be able to read causality, and therefore have access to a higher level of consciousness, his dream could very well have been grafted onto another, much wider project concerning humanity. Or maybe he just has his old dream in mind, his kingdom and his prosperity. In any case, I think he really does care about the fate of its inhabitants, but not out of sympathy for them, no. More like someone playing a management game and wanting to get the best score possible. However, that may not be the case with the other God Hands, particularly Void, or even Idea himself. Perhaps there's another purpose to all this, and Griffith and his long-dreamed-of kingdom are just the linchpins. After all, Shirka will tell us that he is supposed to bring with him an era of darkness upon the world. But on the other hand, if the will of the other God Hands is completely opaque, ideas, as he himself describes in the deleted chapter, is simply to obey the desire of the human unconscious and to manipulate them so that this desire is fulfilled. Thus, the ultra-guided myth with which Griffith took himself to the top would simply be the expression of the desire of the collective human consciousness. A desire based on the misfortune of a minority, the sacrifice of the Falcon troop during the eclipse, then the death of the witches and, in general, of the other sources of the supernatural, but also a desire that rings hollow in its realization, which passes itself off as something absolutely extraordinary and resulting from the free choice of a humanity that would be great and virtuous, when, once again, it was nothing more than a highly guided scenario in which everyone was taken in by the fact that they had a role imbued with goodness and greatness, with a Manichaean enemy to fight, representing absolute evil. It was a kind of idealization of reality, as if the collective human consciousness were basically saying to us, it doesn't matter whether it's true or not, whether humanity lives a lie or not, whether all its choices are guided or not, as long as humanity thinks the world is wonderful and that it's fully satisfied. A kind of illusory fake happiness, where man no longer has the slightest freedom, if he ever had any. A bit like in the Matrix, where humanity would have collectively chosen to take the blue pill and stay in the Matrix, in their comfortable, guided and false lives, having themselves created the Matrix that imprisons and enslaves them.
Anyway, I hope I haven't lost you or gone too far, but all that to say that we can see in this a criticism of humanity's need to feel guided by a force beyond itself, leading them towards a goal so that their life have meaning, even if it means they lose all free will and will live a lie. This is something we already talked about in more detail in the causality video, and it fits in perfectly with Griffith's characters as the driving force behind it all, the embodiment of this common desire. After all, Idea obeys the desire of the collective human consciousness and will tell Griffith that her desire is also his, and that humanity's desire and Griffith's are one and the same.
As a significant event concerning the Griffith of Fantasia, we could also talk about Rickard's slap, but since it doesn't have that much of an impact on him personally, and that it's more important for Rickard's development, we might as well develop all that in a potential little video dedicated to him. You could ask yourself to what extent he's been affected by it, whether he really doesn't give a damn, or whether it's touched him a little. But as you can't see his face, you can't really know, even if logically it shouldn't have any impact on him at all. No, in this last part, we're going to talk about the conclusion of volume 41, and therefore the very last page Miura drew before he died, although I think it was finished by his assistants. And so, of course we're going to be talking about her relationship with the so-called Moonchild, who is none other than the son of Guts and Casca, as I've already explained. They've been sharing the same body since his resurrection, and the Moonchild manifests himself in two ways. Firstly, by influencing Griffith's emotions, causing him to lose his total lack of feeling, albeit very slightly, and secondly, by taking control of his body on the nights of the full moon. And it's precisely on these nights of full moon that the Moonchild will reach out to Guts and Casca, his parents, to help them survive but also to spend a little time with them. Whether it's in volume 28 when he first appears, in volumes 36 and 37 against the God of the Seas, or of course in this terrible last chapter, in which it will be much more detailed, we'll see the group, Guts, and especially Casca, looking after him warmly, like a member of their family. Except that the Moonchild will give way to Griffith on the very last page, where we'll see that the full moon is no longer full. The Moonchild's time is up, and Griffith will say, "I dreamt that on a full moon night, I was a child again. I was surrounded by a familiar warmth. However, when I woke up, all that remained was a vague impression of solitude, which in turn disappeared at once, along with a tear, like the morning dew." In fact, Griffith explains that he experiences each of his transformations into a Moonchild on the nights of the full moon as a dream in which the Moonchild fully conveys his feelings, a dream in which he becomes human again. And when he wakes up, for a moment, he is still the human Griffith he once was. He realizes that he is now completely alone, that his grandeur, his cold pragmatism, and his obsession with fulfilling his dream prevent him from establishing any real relationship with anyone. As we've said, all his current relationships are pure calculation, even the one with Charlotte. He'll never again be able to have relationships like the one he had with Guts, and even Casca, so waking up from a dream with them is bound to be painful, and so he cries, he sheds a tear. But this feeling, this vague impression of loneliness, he forgets immediately after waking up, like you forget a dream you've just had. The God-hand Griffith, devoid of feeling, resurfaces, and as that feeling disappears, so does that single tear running down his cheek. I find this very last panel by Miura outstanding because it sums up all the complexity of Griffith's character. A character who has always been torn by contradictory injunctions, who has had to choose between his dream and guts, between his reason and his feelings, between his greatness and his humanity. And who, even after his choice, even after he is supposed to have become insensitive in order to fulfill his dream, will continue to see this dilemma played out within him because of the moonchild, the child he indirectly created when he raped Casca. It's as if this latest outburst of passion, this hatred he had for Guts, these last feelings he lets exploded during the Eclipse before making them disappear, was ironically the element that created a flaw in him, allowing him to retain a little of his former humanity. As with the Guts video, I'm just going to allow myself a section on the latest chapters released by the Gaga studio, made up of Miura's former assistants and supervised by his best friend Koji Mori, that is, from chapter 365 to chapter 373 as I write this video. And as with Guts, you can fast forward to the next part via the video's chaptering, especially as this time there won't just be a conclusion after this part. Griffith has confronted Guts with his usual disdain, the kind you'd find on Sword Hill, and has kidnapped Casca, taken her back to Falconia, and forced her to stay there, and seems to be aiming for something to the east. What's all this about? Well, we can't be sure about the east, but it's probably linked to the idea of expanding his kingdom or making it prosper. For Casca, on the other hand, I think it's a way of keeping his only weakness, the Moonchild, under control. Since the Moonchild apparently heads towards Casca every full moon, locking her in Falconia will allow him to lock the Moonchild in with her at the same time. This is absolutely essential for Griffith, as Guts now knows that he and the Moonchild are one and the same, so if the Moonchild appeared in front of him with Casca, Guts would just have to cut it in half to kill Griffith normally. That's an extreme danger. And even apart from that, I imagine Griffith doesn't like the slightest thing getting out of hand. We saw that in the Golden Age, and it must be even more the case here. In short, it's clear from this and the way he treats Casca that he doesn't give a damn about her. He might even pull the same trick he did with Rickard and offer to follow his dream, but it's not even certain given the way he snubs her. But we mustn't forget either that she still doesn't remember what happened when Griffith was rescued and the eclipse took place, that it's only coming back to her in bits and pieces, and that it's possible that Griffith will use this to turn her mind. After all, when she wakes up and sees Guts again, he's the one who brings back the memories of the eclipse, and Griffith is presented as the victim, his body tortured. Anyway, I don't want to speculate too much on all that, because that's not what I'm here for, and it would quickly become obsolete anyway. We'll just have to wait and see what happens next. But before concluding, if we're going to do a long video on Griffith, we might as well address the famous question: did Griffith do nothing wrong? This is not my first attempt at analyzing the morality of antagonists, and each time I come up against the same problem. There is obviously no common definition of good and evil. There are lots of different strands of moral philosophy, with their own branches and sub-branches and sub-sub-branches and so on. And since I've had the opportunity to discuss some of them in other videos, like the one on Makima or the one on the farm arc in Vinland Saga, and I don't have the skills or the courage to make a 4-hour video summarizing each of these views, I'm not going to go to the trouble of judging Griffith according to each view of morality one by one. Besides, I don't think that would be very interesting. Instead, I'm going to base my opinion on my own personal view of morality. So at the very least I can tell you my point of view very quickly, so that you know my bias from the outset. In fact, I'm more of a utilitarian. I don't really believe that actions can be fundamentally good, that there are moral axioms, or any of that very Kantian stuff. What guides my actions is rather what I imagine the consequences of my actions to be, and therefore two identical actions may very well be good or bad depending on the context in which they are carried out. As well as the fact that the aim sought through the consequences of my actions is to increase general happiness, basically. Now, what's the point of talking about all this? Of course it's for the Griffith did nothing wrong meme, but also because it's a fairly recurrent topic of discussion around the character, and I really wanted to contribute to the debate. And generally speaking, while discussing the morals of fictional characters isn't of great interest in itself, I find that it's often an interesting point to question when talking about the ridding of an antagonist, and in Griffith's case it allows us to summarize everything we've seen from another point of view. Finally, I don't think Griffith and Femto should be considered as two different characters. On the other hand, given the brutal changes that are about to take place within him, it seems logical to me to separate his character, not into two, but into three phases: Griffith, Femto, and Griffith Resurrected. Griffith was initially a perfectly normal, sensitive guy, with real empathy. You can see this when he saves Casca as a child, or when he is so shocked by the death of the troop's kid that he mutilates himself, and prefers to go into prostitution rather than see it happen again, even though he will pass this off as a rational and calculated decision. He doesn't regard the members of the troop as his friends, but neither do they regard them as mere cannon fodder. He cares about them to a certain extent, as long as they don't interfere with his dream. And we can also see that he has a certain distaste for injustice. He really doesn't seem to appreciate the nobility, for example, who dominate others, even though they are generally incompetent. But his dream requires him to get his hands dirty, and the more time passes, the more he accepts it, the more he lets himself be corrupted little by little. We even see him taking a certain pleasure in playing the deadly game of courtship. First he murders Julius and his son by accident, even though he is happy to see him dead too, then the queen and her servants, and then the mercenaries who took part in the plot to wipe out all traces of it. In general, we sense that he sometimes has sadistic impulses that contradict his kindness and joviality. Judo sums it all up pretty well when he tells Guts, one minute he's giving you a look that'll make your blood run cold, the next he's smiling at you like a newborn baby. In short, there's this ambivalence about him, coupled with the fact that he has to get his hands dirty for his dream, which makes him morally rather ambiguous. But on the other hand, he's aware of the whole thing and will question Guts about it. So you get the impression that he's not some eternal self-centered child with no moral compass, who's going to be kind or cruel depending on his mood at the time, and who wants his castle on a whim without even understanding that his goal is inherently bad, given all the lives he's bound to take in his wake. He's really a character who's constantly torn between his own sensibilities and what his dream drives him to do. In fact, I think Griffith is someone who would have dreamt of living in a Manichaean world. He would have dreamt of seeing himself as a hero, fighting only fundamentally evil people, but reality will quickly remind him of the complexity of the matter, and maybe that's why he made his whole fight against Ganishka so Manichaean, to turn reality into what he wanted it to be. But all in all, I think Griffith, as portrayed in the Golden Age, is a pretty good character, who is far from being just an ambitious guy who plays the nice guy out of sheer calculation. And even up until the Eclipse, until the fateful moment of sacrifice, I'm tempted to say that the decision to sacrifice the troop, even if it's not a moral act of course, no kidding, is a completely logical act, and quite difficult to reprehend. Of course there's his dream and all, but even if you keep your head down, you have to realize that it was either sacrificing the troop or dying himself. At least, that's what Ubik will have him believe when he shows him his past by pretending to be the old lady. And speaking of Ubik's words, if we question Griffith's morality, we can obviously question his responsibility in all this. When we know that it was Idea who did everything possible to bring Griffith to this point, and that he was basically the product of a social determinism that he couldn't do anything about anyway, can we really hold him responsible for all this? If we focus on the Eclipse, for example, we have a Griffith who emerges from a year of non-stop torture at the bottom of a hole, who has been deprived of speech and movement, disfigured, handicapped for life, seeing his dream completely dashed when he was so close to achieving it, knowing that Guts wanted to leave him again, where Godhand takes him through a sort of hyper-oriented flashback to his childhood, where Ubik first tries to normalize the very idea of sacrifice, to titillate his bias of sunk costs, then to present this sacrifice as his only possible escape from death, and to make him understand that he has no other possible choice. How could Griffith, having undergone such conditioning, have chosen anything other than troop sacrifice? Seriously, if someone told you when you were disabled and about to die that you could become a super-powered god simply by doing something immoral that you had already done 100 times, and that refusing to do it again would make those 100 other times pointless, do you honestly think you would have had the abnegation required to not sacrifice anyone? In fact, Griffith's dream was basically an immoral dream. I've already talked a bit about it in the Vinland Saga video, but any conquest of power is immoral from my point of view, especially in this warlike form, and as soon as he was caught up in it, while he was still a child and therefore not necessarily aware of it, it was just a game after all. There was no turning back. He was doomed to get there. He was determined to become Femto. You could even say that the concept of a dream is bad in itself. It's an idea developed by the American filmmaker Vincente Minnelli and talked about by the French philosopher Gilles Deleuze in a 1987 lecture on what the creative act is, and I can't resist showing you this extract as it fits so perfectly with this theme so important to the whole of Berserk.
Minnelli, là, il me semble une idée extraordinaire sur le rêve. Elle est très simple, on peut la dire, et il est engagé dans tout un processus cinématographique qui est l'œuvre de Minnelli. Et la grande idée de Minnelli sur le rêve, il me semble, c'est que le rêve concerne avant tout ceux qui ne rêvent pas. Le rêve de ceux qui rêvent concerne ceux qui ne rêvent pas. Et pourquoi ça les concerne? Parce que dès qu'il y a rêve de l'autre, il y a danger. À savoir que le rêve des gens est toujours un rêve dévorant qui risque de nous engloutir. Et que les autres rêves, c'est très dangereux. Et que le rêve est une terrible volonté de puissance. Et que chacun de nous est plus ou moins victime du rêve des autres. Même quand c'est la plus gracieuse jeune fille, même quand c'est la plus gracieuse jeune fille, c'est une terrible dévorante, pas par son âme, mais par ses rêves. Méfiez-vous du rêve de l'autre, parce que si vous êtes pris dans le rêve de l'autre, vous êtes foutu. Bon, ne soyez jamais pris dans le rêve de l'autre.
Griffith, during the Golden Age, was little more than a slave to his dream, a destructive dream that clashed with everyone around him as much as with his own desires. That's why I don't think this Griffith is inherently bad, that he can't really be said to have acted badly because he was acted upon by forces beyond his control, forces he couldn't fight, which will be just the opposite of Femto. As I said earlier, Griffith is going to change completely all of a sudden, for reasons that are still rather unclear, and is going to do what you know to Casca, which seems to be revenge on Guts. It's awful, completely gratuitous, and a bit inconsistent with the Griffith we saw a few pages earlier. I tried to explain the reasons for this sudden change in behavior earlier, but there's no definite answer that would justify it. For me, the real reasons behind what he did to Casca remain one of the manga's most ambiguous points. It's also worth noting that he'll be just as cruel when he sees Guts again at the end of the Black Warrior arc, treating him like a crawling sacrifice. Although I'd point out again that at the time, Miura didn't know what story he was going to tell, and it's possible that this behavior is an inconsistency, as we discussed in the Guts video, but personally it seems completely coherent to me and supports the fact that Femto and the God Hands in general are fundamentally evil. What's more, this time the question of responsibility, determinism and all that doesn't really come up because we're told, through the deleted chapter but also via indirect evidence throughout the manga that I talked about in the causality video, that the God Hands control causality, that they're its agents, literally the hand of God. When Idea makes Griffith a God Hand, he frees him from determinism. He stops guiding his life as he guides those of other humans. He puts him above all that. He sets him free. Well, in reality, in absolute terms, that's not true. Griffith's past still influences him because he's still obsessed with his dream, and he's still a slave to it in a way. No one can escape all determination unless they are an empty shell. What's more, if it's in the very nature of the God Hands to be evil, and Griffith can't therefore go against his nature, well, in absolute terms he's not responsible either, but whatever. All that doesn't change the main point about Femto. He behaves immorally. He seems to be purely evil. And the reason why I make a distinction between Femto and Griffith 2.0 is that, in my opinion, they differ in the sense that while the former is immoral, the latter is amoral. Someone who is immoral is someone who strives to apply the opposite of morality, who violates its principles, who seeks to be bad in fact. Whereas someone who is amoral will be completely ignorant of morality, will ignore it completely, and will therefore be able to act morally or immorally without trying to be, without taking these concepts into consideration. And I think that's what it's all about for Griffith after he returns to the real world. He looks very different to Femto when he sees Guts at Swords Hill, for example. He won't be cruel to him, just indifferent. Throughout his campaign against the Kushans until the end of Volume 34, and even afterwards in his management of Falconia, he will act in an excessively moral manner, but he will only do so out of pure calculation, because he knows it's the best thing to do for the fulfillment of his dream. At no point does he do it out of any real moral conviction. At the same time, he's up to some dirty tricks, like murdering Flora and other witches. But all this raises real questions. Because even if his goal is not a noble one, even if he has sacrificed a great deal and made people suffer to get there, the result is that humanity is united around the same banner, in a much fairer world that is progressing at every level, with an exceptional city, a kind of emperor god, for those who have the reference, who puts everyone on the same wavelength from a religious point of view, and who even manages to make people forget the fear of death. In short, a true utopia. But in the end, isn't it a good thing that Griffith sacrificed the troop? It's funny because we're really in the same situation as with the video I did on Makima from Chainsaw Man, except that Griffith was able to go all the way. I'm not going to go into everything I talked about in that video, about the limits of utilitarianism and the scapegoat argument, but this might be a good opportunity to tell you about something that inspired me to think about this at the time, and which is, I think, even more obvious here. I'm talking about the short story Those Who Leave Omelas by Ursula K. Le Guin, a great American science fiction and fantasy writer, the author of Terramar and other books for those who know her. To put it simply, this novel tells the story of the utopian city of Omelas, where absolutely everyone is happy, but where all this magical utopia is based on the misfortune of a single kid locked in a cupboard and living alone in his own piss and excrement. Everyone in Omelas knows this, but there's nothing anyone can do about it, because all the happiness in this city would collapse if we alleviated even a little of his suffering. But sometimes, in reaction to this, people simply decide to leave Omelas, too consumed by guilt to enjoy happiness based on so much suffering. I discovered it thanks to Mystify's French channel, who did a reading followed by an analysis which was really great, so I recommend it to you. But all that to say that Falconia is more or less the same situation. Even if, in this case, the inhabitants are unaware of the sacrifice on which the city relies. But even if they did know, what could they do about it? Would it really be immoral to enjoy the pleasures of Falconia knowing all this? Wouldn't it be a waste of that sacrifice to leave? Wouldn't it be an irrational, even selfish choice to clear one's conscience by leaving? And in the end, wouldn't the troops' sacrifice be a terrible evil for an infinitely greater good? In short, would you, like some of the inhabitants of Omelas, leave Falconia? Finally, I'd like to conclude this section with Miura's words from the 2016 guidebook on this subject. We tend to judge manga characters according to the ally, enemy, or good-bad divide, but I've tried to avoid building Berserk on this sense of values. Griffith is fascinating as he is, and if you look at it from his point of view, Guts may well be the villain. What's more, the world he builds might be better suited to some people. It remains to be seen how the Fantasia stage of this story will turn out. Just as Guts is attached to the image of the cool, badass, gruff character when he's infinitely more than that, Griffith is often described as a rather monolithic, purely evil character who would have been the same from the start. And of course, he's much more than that. But to analyze Griffith, you have to interpret and dare to develop some rather ambiguous points that are sometimes based on dialogue with potential double meanings, particular facial expressions, or even analysis of the paneling. And of course, there's no guarantee that we're getting it right or wrong, especially as Berserk isn't finished yet. And even if we learn more about Griffith in the future when the story continues, there's no guarantee that all our questions will be answered, since the very essence of the character lies in the mystery that surrounds him and the fascination that stems from it. If Griffith is such a striking character for me, apart from the Eclipse when his monstrosity left its mark on people's minds, it's firstly thanks to this mix between a character who is both very mysterious and charismatic, but who is torn between his dreams and his emotions, between his greatness and his humanity, who suddenly finds himself at a low point after having been at a high point because of his emotions. Then, in a second phase, the film simply shines for its perfection, driven by breathtaking direction, with exceptional drawings, composition and cutting, and of course all that this implies narratively, which we've discussed at length. And then there's his extraordinary confrontation with Guts, in which love, friendship, admiration, fascination, incomprehension, jealousy, hatred, so many complex and at first sight contradictory feelings come together. There's so much to say about Griffith, so many theories and interpretations to be made, so many angles from which to approach him, that there will always be new things to say about this character. Even forgetting that the manga isn't finished, this complete analysis is bound to be incomplete. Just like Guts' analysis, by the way. But here we are, with all the pretension I'm capable of. I wanted to give it my all once again, to make the most complete video possible on the character who is my second favorite this time, a character who fascinates me as much by his writing as by the aura he exudes, Griffith. Well done for getting to the end of this video. I'd originally planned to do it in 3 parts, but seeing as you liked the long video about Guts, I thought you'd prefer one big video. We'll see if the Guts video isn't just a miracle. And here's hoping that, unlike the Guts video, I don't get demonetized and that it continues to be referenced. I also hope that most of you didn't take offense when I started tackling divisive subjects like homosexuality, religion, morality, etc. And that even if you completely disagree, you'll be able to remain courteous in your comments, ideally with good counter-arguments. In any case, if you enjoyed it, you can like, comment, share, subscribe and all that. And next time, as you can probably imagine, we're going to be talking about Casca. Well, this time I don't think the video will last an hour, thankfully. But as usual, I'm going to take good care of it and make some other videos in the meantime, so it won't be out just yet. In the meantime, you can watch or rewatch the other 2 videos on Berserk, and then we'll meet up again for the 3rd and final member of this incredible trio.